it really started as a love affair with hiking. Grew up in New England, outside of Boston, and went up to New Hampshire's White Mountains pretty much every weekend with family and so on. Eventually ended up working for the Appalachian Mountain Club and running all up and down the mountains in there. And I think the first sort of really sort of serious long distance thing that I did was the Appalachian Mountain Club Hut Traverse back in, I think, 1989. That really
Mhm.
makes me old. It's about 54 miles from end to end, pretty much across the White Mountain National Forest. And, it was much more a speed hike than it was any sort of ultra run. But, to put all that together was kind of a big deal at the time. And it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to what's possible.
This episode of the Smart Athlete Podcast is brought to you by Solpre. If you're active at all, whether you're running or simply out walking for the day, you've probably experienced one of the number one problems that active people have, and that's chafing. Solpre's all-new, all-natural anti-chafe balm solves that problem while feeding your skin the vital nutrients it needs to be healthy. If you'd like to stop chafing once and for all and treat your body right, go to solpri.com to check out the anti-chafe balm today. That's SOLPRI.com. Welcome to the Smart Athlete Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Funk. My guest today is the head of college at Schumacher College in Devon, England. He's a runner. He's a lot of other things, but I don't know that we can quite sum them all up with the credentials. Welcome to the show, Pavel Cenkl.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So, Pavel, I feel like as I'm trying to do research on you before our conversation. So before every show, I'm looking into, like, you have a blog, so I'm trying to look through that and trying to unpack who you are. And just to be frank, having a very tough time trying to pigeonhole you, I guess, and know quite where to start. So let's just start with running, because that's the easy one. You've been running, I think, for over 30 years now, so you've got a decade on me. How did you get started running? Why has the love affair lasted so long?
Oh, yeah, great question. I would like, 30 years, that's being generous, I guess, but, it makes me sound really old when you say it that way. So, yeah, well, and hopefully we'll talk about age at some point, because that's been becoming a greater interest of mine as I get older. So thinking about running as an older person too. But it really started as a love affair with hiking. Grew up in New England, outside of Boston, and went up to New Hampshire's White Mountains pretty much every weekend with family and so on. Eventually ended up working for the Appalachian Mountain Club and running all up and down the mountains in there. And I think the first sort of really sort of serious long distance thing that I did was the Appalachian Mountain Club Hut Traverse back in, I think, 1989. That really makes me old. It's about 54 miles from end to end, pretty much across the White Mountain National Forest. And, it was much more a speed hike than it was any sort of ultra run. But, to put all that together was kind of a big deal at the time. And it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to what's possible, and that you can go for 20 hours or so straight, through the night and so on, and what an experience that really is. I didn't really sign up for any races or start running really seriously until I got into my late 20s, early 30s even, and then didn't start racing at any ultras until I think I was about 40. So really kind of late to the game. And again, I think it comes, really through a long history of just hiking in different places and really experiencing mountains at sort of a faster pace, seeing how far we can go in a day, how many peaks we can do in a day. And then that sort of naturally evolves into, all right, well, let's see if we can, run 150 miles over a couple days, or let's pick these really kind of obscure trails that not a lot of people do and see if we can, run across those in some sort of, relative speed. And that really opened up a window for me starting in, I think, about 2013, 2014, when I started this climate run project that you referenced at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
that really started. It was really a pivot point for me in my professional career, in my teaching that I was doing at the time at Sterling College in Vermont, and then thinking about a way that sort of my growing love for ultra running and racing and that sort of thing um, came together, and I was trying to find a way to really do something more meaningful for myself with that ambition and with that passion. And I had been teaching environmental humanities. I've got degrees in English and American literature, and I've been teaching environmental writing, environmental literature, for many years. And I started teaching a bit in environmental philosophy as well. And for me, the philosophy and the running actually really came together, when I first started running these long distances across remote landscapes. And then to weave into that, issues of climate change, and ways that I might be able to leverage conversations about human impact on the environment, using some of these sort of, I guess, more notable, runs that I've done,
Mm-hmm.
that I can go out and do and then come back and give a presentation about and have generative conversations about, well, so I went to this place and actually climate change is starkly visible here because of glacial melt and post-glacial, isostatic rebound and all sorts of, physical attributes, as well
Mm-hmm.
as, the impact of global warming, climate change on indigenous communities in northern Scandinavia, for example, and then come back and begin to have conversations in the States or in England or wherever about, what a little bit about what we can do, but also about how we can actually build more resilient relationships with the broader world through doing some of these actions and activities. Now that can lead to our being able to take care of our environment a bit more proactively. Yeah, so there's a lot
Yeah,
there.
yeah, a lot to unpack. Um, so that's one of the things I was trying to unpack was, how are you taking the runs and I don't mean this in a negative way, but how are
Yep.
you doing anything with them? Like there are people that just go out and do those runs, but they're not taking the run and the experience and trying to use it as a dialogue to shape any kind of change.
Right.
It's just a personal experience.
Yeah.
It is kind of interesting that you mention, seeing the impacts of climate change in these particular environments.
Yeah.
That it's like, as I don't know that I could call either a scientist, maybe you, but I don't know that I call myself a scientist, but a believer in science for sure.
Yeah.
I think, well, I'm a kind of mathematician by training,
Oh, nice.
so like I believe the numbers. So like
Yeah.
it's enough for me to see the numbers and go, well, obviously like there's a trend here that is abnormal.
Yeah.
But I think for the majority of people, it becomes especially prescient when you can see it. When it's like, okay, well, we go to this environment and there were glaciers, I don't know, 20 meters high, and now they're
That's
a
right.
foot,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, glaciers are perhaps the most obvious
yeah.
indicator. And so that's why I was really drawn to those particular landscapes, Iceland, northern Scandinavia, Svalbard,
Mm-hmm.
because glacial recession, glacial meltback is a really quantifiable impact of global climate change and warming in that instance. But I do want to pause just a bit and say that, well, it's becoming much more visible just about everywhere.
Right.
And it's a matter of sort of interpreting that data, and that's where your point about, well, you believe in science. I think that there are a lot of people that choose to either ignore it or think about sort of, well, this is a qualitative thing. For example, here in Devon, we had the wettest winter in some 200 years. It basically rained from the day I arrived in October all the way through to March,
Mm-hmm.
with very little respite, lots of flooding all around the region. And then autumn, like a switch, in March, we had the now sunniest spring in the last 150 years. So we went from being inundated and flooding to a drought situation pretty much overnight. And it only just rains substantively the other day for the first time in, I don't know, 3 months, ever since lockdown really started.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, you scratch your head at that, you say, oh, it's an anomaly, but, it's a direct impact of, climate systems around the world being changed in really dramatic ways. So it does drive that point home. But for me to be able to then make to draw the thread between our experience here in these regions to places like Iceland and Svalbard and Norway and Sweden is really interesting. Because let's look at Iceland for an example, right? Right when I was doing the research, and I researched the areas pretty extensively before going on these runs, and find contacts there and talk to glaciologists and biologists, botanists, social scientists, etc., and effectively interview people, either along the way or before and after, just to create some context and learn a bit more about the landscape. So there was a study that came out in 2014, and I can share that with you at some point. I find the link. But it was the very first study that actually tied the melting of the glaciers specifically with anthropogenic climate change. So they were able to connect the dots in a way that nobody had before. And they published a map in 2014 of places where the land, the Earth's crust, was actually rising as a result of the glacials receding, right? So when the glacial recedes, you have this thing called isostatic rebound or post-glacial rebound, where the crust, in fact, springs back. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was really fascinating, both on sort of this metaphoric level, where you're talking about the Earth rebounding as you're running across it. It's kind of something that you think about as a runner as well, sort of this dynamic movement rebounding across the landscape. As well as, there were places where that rebound was pretty dramatic, millimeters or even a couple centimeters over a course of a year. So you could almost, if you're really patient, sort of sit and watch the ground rise. And the fact that that was directly connected to anthropogenic climate change really struck me as being pretty profound. That, literally what we do wherever in the world contributing to greenhouse gas emissions has the impact that it melts some many billions of tons of ice per year, and then that the literal crust of the Earth is rising as a result of that. To me, to be able to make those threads and connections is really interesting and important, and that's been eye-opening for a lot of audiences that I've talked to as well. And then to take that a bit further and say, well, so what, right? What's this is Iceland, right. This island in the North Atlantic. But you'll recall back in 2010 they had a volcanic eruption there that actually stopped transatlantic commerce for quite some time because airplanes couldn't fly because of the particulate matter in the air. That could happen much more frequently with this destabilization of the Earth's crust, right? So again, I'm not a scientist in that respect, but to understand these processes and to recognize the real interconnectedness of the human systems, the economic systems, and the ecological ones, that for me was really an important piece to be able to bring back and to integrate into my teaching and into my presentations.
I think kind of the two biggest hurdles in taking that information and approaching the so what question to the masses are, number one, how do you communicate the impact of a couple centimeters?
Yeah.
Because when out of context, when you just say it's a couple centimeters, well, it's in the things that we measure in everyday life, it's pretty small.
Yeah.
So it's like I feel like you have to get that some degree of scale and communicate that in some fashion.
Yeah.
But then also just getting to the point of overcoming people's short-term memory.
Yeah.
Because we don't have memories of 100 years ago, or sometimes even a decade ago. It's hard to be like, well, what was the weather like?
Yeah.
So it's like you've got to get over that part too and show why it directly impacts this person living in nowhere, Tennessee. Like,
right.
They just don't care if they're like I'll go Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a little flawed, but it's an okay model. If somebody's concerned about where am I going to eat today, they're definitely not super concerned about the climate is changing. It's like, well, I need food.
Absolutely. And to be clear, a couple centimeters of Earth crust rising is one metric in a really complex system.
Right.
And what I most of the conversations I have around climate change and these sorts of issues are about the complexity of the system,
Mm.
and that in fact that's the thing we need to focus on, and not so much the individual metrics or indicators, but much more the connections between nodes, between the data sets, right? So what are the relationships? How do we sort of recognize that we are connected to these things, even if it's, you have to jump several points to get there,
Mm-hmm.
just to recognize that, yeah, we are part of this much broader socioecological system, right? There was a trio of courses that I taught right before I left Sterling College that were in effectively applications of environmental philosophy that really focused on this concept of post-humanism, right? And the idea that, what would the world look like and how would we talk about it differently if we recognize we weren't really at the center of everything?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it seems like an obvious thing for the two of us to say. It's like, yeah, well, of course,
Right.
it's a complicated system. But if you actually think about that and model, various like economic systems or educational systems with that in mind, then it dramatically changes everything, right? And to sort of get people to see that, in fact, yeah, it's one really complicated, interwoven, messy, sometimes really not very pretty web. Then yeah, that's really what I'm hoping that people take away from this. Like, yeah, it's all a mess, but we're a part of that mess. It's not over here.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of us.
I think part of the issue in communicating that is almost just our limited ability to understand. I think we can say pretty definitively we are the, if not one of the most intelligent, uh, animals on the planet. Certainly the best tool creators, and so I think as humans we hold ourselves in pretty high regard.
Yep.
You know, and
For
I
better,
do think do what
for better or for worse, I think.
right for better or for worse.
Yeah.
But because of that, I think that also leaves a blind spot where it's like, well, right now, say we don't understand, we're beginning to understand these complex systems and trying to break them down, and it'll take some time in teams of people. And by teams, I mean hundreds or thousands and gathering data.
Right.
But it's like you have this idea of, well, it's always been this way, our behavior, our way of thinking. So why would it be any different? And no matter what it changes to, people still seem to settle back into that. This is the way it's always been.
It hasn't always been, right?
Right.
We've undergone a massive evolution, even if you think about the start of the industrial era or even before that. How it's this argument that goes on, it's like, when did climate change actually start?
Right.
Right. And I'm not that interested in, identifying a particular date or part of a century or when that began, because I think it's been a long, slow evolution.
Yeah.
And I would say that it's not so much a matter of going back to anywhere, like back to a time before, greenhouse gases or some sort of idyllic Jeffersonian agricultural, utopia. I don't think that's really what we're looking for either, because that's not possible, right? We can only move forward. So for me, it's figuring out. It's interesting. Before I sort of went to Iceland for that first long run, I started thinking, well, I want to get some corporate sponsors and, think about, well, this is going to be all about helping athletes make better decisions about, the products that they use, and maybe we can, leverage some changes in some manufacturing processes or some distribution networks or something like that to to lessen the impact that athletes themselves are having, on the. And I very quickly realized, I think through my personal experience, that it was much less about that for me. Those are also important things, and absolutely we need to follow through on, being as light as we can. But for me, it was much more about, once you're out in the midst of, nowhere. I mean, it's not nowhere, but way out there, and have effectively sort of opened yourself up to the world around you. In a way that if you're pushing your body and to such an extent running 50K or 50 miles or more per day, you've opened up a vulnerability, to the weather, to, the amount of daylight, to your own body and potential injuries, that sort of thing. You really, I feel, I'm laying myself bare to that environment. And in those moments, and I can even pinpoint really specific moments where I've had this sort of, awareness of this happening, you really feel that the boundaries between the self and the more than human world are beginning to blur. And in that moment of vulnerability, I think we can build really serious resilience in our ability to build relationships across that boundary, right? And so, if we think about these really complex systems, and as you're talking about how we get people to care about that, if that's not the first thing on their mind, I think the first thing on a lot of people's minds is sort of themselves and their relationship to the world around them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if I can use even these, talking about these really complicated things, and some vocabulary that people might not immediately get, and all these esoteric data sets, it's really about one person in a landscape, think sort of reflecting on their relationship with that place, and how the physical exertion, or sort of the movement across that landscape, helps open up pathways into building more resilient relationships. And I think we can do that anywhere, anytime. It's just a matter of sort of intention, and having sort of the right, I don't know, sort of the opportunity, and being able to open one's eyes to those opportunities.
You had said, and I think I read this on your blog too, the phrase more than human experience. I think I'm saying that right. And that really, even as I read that, it kind of jarred my head. And I mean, I feel like between the two of us, you especially, or probably more than me, know the power of words,
Mm.
and how certain words are evocative, where it's like, without context, when you think about that, you're like, well, what does that mean? Are we talking about a spiritual plane? And your at least my brain tries to go to these explanations, but it's like, well, no, it's just like it's the world around us that it's non-human, like all the things that aren't us. But and obviously I'm guilty of this. Even my own brain's like, well, it's me. Like this is my world. This is my show.
Yeah,
Um, but I think that's a great phrase to open a conversation about
absolutely.
everything that's going on, because it is so jarring. Like, what are you talking about more than human? Like, we're it.
That's right. It's that shift of perspective, and it's a pretty deliberate turn of phrase. And sometimes I stumble over it because it doesn't roll off the tongue
Right.
quite as easily. But deliberately different from humans and their environment, or humans and nature, or even human and non-human, because that sets up this binary opposition of here we are on one side and here's the non-human on the other. And I think it's vitally important to think about we are actually part of this more than human network, right? We're part of this, what many people have called a socio-ecological system and network. That and realizing that, I think, is one big step forward to helping to address issues like climate change, even if they don't feel immediately tangible.
Mm-hmm. So so far, you started doing Climate Run. Was it 2014? Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. So what kind of reception have you gotten so far from people?
I'd say quite positive. Yeah. So it's been, comes in waves, right? Because I went to Iceland, then I came back, and I gave a lot of presentations there. Based in Vermont, I was invited out as far as Ohio and as far south as North Carolina, to give talks to various groups.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened once again after I went to on the next trip, and then again after the next trip, and so on. And I've given talks to really pretty any you name the type of constituency, whether it's a small group at a local outdoor shop, or it's a group. There was, I think, 300 or 400 middle school girls at a private school in Ohio that I talked to about sort of building personal resilience through athletics. And that really resonated super well, because think about that age and that gender, and sort of dealing with all sorts of issues of um, you know athletics and sort of body image, and
Mm-hmm.
creating communities and building resilience. So that worked out really well, and it's a slightly different talk, right? A different conversation. But always the entry into it is like, hey, look at this cool place I went to, and beautiful pictures and videos and great stories of me almost drowning doing a river crossing, or falling through the ice over here, and all these really cool stories that really grip people. And then that's the entry into having the conversation you need to have. And so, what I hope to do, right, is to continue these for a bit longer. I've begun writing a book. Some of it, I think I published a couple of excerpts on the blog. And tentative title is Running North, but that's probably going to change. I think that's a bit vague. But really, it's going to get at sort of this interweaving of philosophy, climate change awareness, and running, and think about how to tell that story in the best possible way. That again, it's not just a story of, hey, Pavel goes running and here are these cool stories, but that those are the entry into some deeper conversations about some of the issues we're talking about here.
I kind of thinking about the dichotomy of, we're talking about trying to get beyond our own egos to see all of the complex systems around us. And again, I mean this in a loving way. But then also the idea that, like, you're just one guy who has some notion that, okay, I'm going to go make an impact. Just me. But, so it's like both this interesting dichotomy of we need to look beyond ourselves, yet I also have to take it upon myself, if nobody else is going to do it, to get this conversation started and try to impact people.
Right. And, again, I'm one of many people who are doing this kind, maybe not exactly this thing, but this sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I don't hold myself up to be any sort of special case, but, trying to do my part in a way. But the dichotomy you talk about is really interesting because, we have, for better or for worse, again, this narrative of sort of the lone explorer going out into the landscape, and whether it's going to the North Pole or climbing Everest, or just running a couple hundred miles, that is kind of a cultural Western motif, that this is what we do. And so I'm always conscious of that and thinking about, well, okay, so am I being a complete hypocrite by coming out here? And I've had some of those conversations, right? People have said in the past, well, it's like, why is it that you're taking a flight to Scandinavia to run a couple hundred miles so you can come back here and then tell us all about climate change? Aren't you contributing to the problem? And it's like, well, honestly, we're all contributing to the problem, really, by dint of living in the societies that we live in. And it's not an excuse, but I think we need to be really conscientious about how we use the resources that we're using, and whether we're actually creating some overall benefit for conversation, for society, for sort of helping people recognize the complexity of the situation. And maybe that's just a way to justify flying out and then taking a run. But at the same time, I think that the sort of relationships that I've been able to create or develop by doing these adventure runs, and then the conversations I've been able to have once I've come back, right, I think really sort of demonstrate, I think, that the importance of going out and being able to tell that story and being able to come back and share those experiences. But yeah, I mean, it definitely, I'm always aware of that dichotomy and that sort of that duality of, well, yeah, should I really be out here doing this in the first place? Aren't there sort of better things we could be spending our time on? But I think this is my way of participating in these conversations, and other people have different ways of doing that. So.
And I think that's a tough thing that we run into. Excuse me. When people are, for lack of a better term, I'll say, criticizing you taking a flight to go somewhere to come back to talk about climate change, is that, I guess a couple of things, but just one, are you really gonna like get in a canoe and paddle your way? Like, like it just doesn't make sense logistically, number one, but also the idea that if you've it's like if you've ever done anything that's counter to what would be held as like the most virtuous, golden, perfect person,
Right.
then your idea is discounted. And it's like, okay, it's okay, and I think good to be critical
Yep.
of people and say, are you consistent with your message? Are you living what you're preaching?
Absolutely.
But at the same time, there has to be some kind of give and take where you have just the realization, the idea that like, okay, like we're not going to tell Pavel to become an ultra distant swimmer and swim across the pond and then go on a hike. It
Right.
doesn't. It's just it's nonsensical. In it bothers me in this context, but in many contexts when people try to just say, well, there's this one thing wrong, so therefore the whole premise is bunk. You know
Right.
what I mean? So it's kind
Yeah.
of interesting to see how you've dealt with that because that is a tough thing to get around. Since I think that's a pervasive idea right now.
Right. And I think across the spectrum of sort of different conversations that are happening in our society currently, actually. I mean, there's some pretty tough conversations happening currently.
Right.
And I read something just yesterday or the day before about, well, recognize that, most people are participating in these conversations in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
You may not be out doing, activity X, you may not be doing Y, but maybe you're doing Z, and that's perfectly great. But just to recognize there are multiple approaches to any challenge, to any problem. And I think the importance is to be, the important part is that we're all moving in kind of the right direction, right, or a positive way.
I'm trying to look this up. See, I get the name of this right. I think that's right. Um, so in this conversation and all the conversations going on right now, I think I'm a big fan of stand up. I don't know how much comedy you watch, but um, I love Dave Chappelle, and in one of his specials, he was speaking about the Me Too movement at the time. Um, but the idea that he brought up seems prescient to me in any conversation where people may seem hypocritical.
Yeah.
And it was basically, I'm paraphrasing, I'm sure I'll butcher it, but that if you want to break a system, currently, like in the U.S. and in protests around the world, we're talking about racism.
Yeah.
In this case, we're talking about the systems of, human, I'll say, economics and its impact on the climate. In any system that you want to break, you're going to have imperfect allies.
Mm.
People that maybe they've done something that belongs to that system that's having that negative impact, but they're here now and they're trying to figure out how to help. So if
Exactly.
you skewer them and you say if you've ever done anything wrong you can't participate,
Right.
then you are most likely not going to break that system.
That's
You
right.
have to embrace that the people that want to help may be a part of that system,
Yep.
and you actually need them to break the system because you need to have all the information of how the system works before you can change it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, coming back to what we've been talking about, recognizing how complex that system is,
Right.
necessarily gives people a little bit of leeway that, yeah, I would love to be able to do X, but I think we need to shift our conversation a little bit more before we're even able to do that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, oh, this is a question. We're still on topic. I do want to ask what you think. How much responsibility does each person have as a runner or just as a general person in terms of conservation and affecting change? Because, like I said, there's this dichotomy of
Yeah.
I have responsibility, yet I'm only one person.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So I've been having some conversations about this lately. The difference between maybe it's semantics, but for me it's important because words are what I do.
Right.
Uh, Between sort of the word sustainability, which everybody seems to know what that means,
Mm-hmm.
although I think it's much more complex again, and the word regenerative. and which is, has been, or it's an up and coming term. There are a lot of sort of centers for regenerative study, and regenerative agriculture is a big thing. And sort of the definitions of those two words are really important. Sustainable to me, and it's not just my definition, but really is about, how can we minimize our impact on the more than human world, right? As we go about our daily business, and how can we sustain what we're doing for the longest possible period without creating circumstances that don't allow that to happen, right? So how can we basically keep doing what we're doing, but do it in such a way that minimizes our impact? And I think that's really important, right? Because it makes us sort of look at things like, oh, well, we need more electric vehicles, or we need more public transportation, or we need to take fewer flights, and we need to do this, and we do that, fewer dependence on fossil fuel, less dependence on fossil fuels, and so on. Regenerative, on the other hand, is, I think, an evolution of that. It basically, from my perspective, talks about that same relationship, but instead of minimizing our impact, how can everything that we do have a positive impact, a net positive impact on the more than human world, and help to actually regenerate and build a greater resilient relationship with everything that's around us. And that, for me, those are like night and day, right? Can we just sort of try to maintain the status quo with some, minor changes? We switch everything to wind power, everything to solar power, but we don't change our overall lifestyle and impact that we have. That's more sustainability, which is an important step. I think a step beyond that, which is really effective in smaller scale enterprises, is to sort of give back as much as possible in everything that you do, right? So again, it's that idea of shifting the sense of, well, humans are not at the center of the conversation, or they should not always be. Then how does that change things if we think of the whole complexity of the system as being at the center of the conversation, right? I think that changes your daily decision making in a massive way.
Well, it's like I feel like there's two approaches basically. Where you're describing the approach where we're basically trying to take baby steps.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, we're doing negative impact. Let's figure out how to stop impacting things negatively, right, maintain the status quo, and then the next step is, okay, how do we get the trend line to start going back up in a positive direction? But then there's the whole other, way of thinking about it, where it's like we're having a negative impact. How do we just suddenly switch directions and go to positive instead of hitting that bottom and staying there?
Yeah.
And that's the ideal situation.
That's
but
right.
I think you have a lot of inertia, economic, mental, cultural, all that kind of stuff to overcome. And that's part of why it's almost necessary that on our own, we have that sustainability kind of step.
Yep.
Unless by outside forces we are forced to change, like with all the stay-at-home orders.
Yep.
I think that's an outside force we had no control over. I'll say that relatively. That's a whole other conversation. But just it forces a lot of employers to say, okay, well, maybe we don't need everybody to come in the office. And then that's where you can make a sharp direction the other way, where it's like, okay, now we don't need all these cars on the road every single day versus let's go to electric vehicles.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you're right that we need an evolution, sort of a transformative change through sustainability as a stepping stone to potentially a regenerative relationship and so on. And it's interesting to think about the COVID-19 situation that has, global pandemic crisis,
right,
that has put people in these positions of pausing a lot of this activity that contributes to greenhouse gases or contributes to climate change or contributes to, what we would think of as environmentally, negative impacts. There are a lot of conversations, and I administrate in higher education, so there are a lot of conversations about higher education and how, this is the thing that's going to change the future of higher education. Mm-hmm. I absolutely hope so. On my own, working with my colleagues and contacts, we're trying to do just that, right? To make some shifts in the future of higher education to do more offsite, learning potentially, so international students don't necessarily need to travel, to sort of rethink the way that we're doing residential education, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of great opportunity there to really rethink pedagogy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the same conversations among ecologists and environmentalists saying, this is that moment that hopefully will make this seismic shift. But I worry on all of those counts, right? As lockdowns start to lessen around the world, we are very quickly going back to exactly the same habits that we, right? Where, shopping, for example, just like after 9/11, I pointed out to someone the other day that, George Bush was quick to say, in response to this, we need to continue our lives as usual. And I think he was quoted as, we need to go out and spend money and help the economy move forward and effectively go shopping. There's a lot of that right now as well. People have been at home for weeks and weeks without the opportunity to go out and buy the things that they may need, but also to queue up and go to IKEA for that thing that they may not need, but now they have the opportunity to go get it.
Right.
So is it a sort of reversion or a continuation of business as usual? Or is there in fact going to be something that has shifted? It's like, well, all right, we managed to do without those things for this amount of time. That's made me think, well, look at the money we may have saved, or the job that we may no longer have, so we can't afford to do this. Then maybe that has a knock-on effect, and is positive. But these are tricky paths to walk because there are a lot of pressures from different sides, for sure.
I kind of think of, I wish it was as easy as this is an opportunity for all of humanity to get together and, make that sharp direction towards correction and regeneration. But although I'm typically an optimist, I'm a little pessimistic in this situation where I don't think it's that easy.
Yeah.
And because of like what I mentioned earlier, basically people's short-term memory. And think about this is 1 year. I live in Kansas City, so 4 months ago the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. That seems like a lifetime ago. 3 months ago, everybody was obsessed with Tiger King.
Yeah.
No, nobody cares anymore.
Yeah. That's right.
We're not even talking in a matter of years. We're just talking months.
Yeah, you're right.
How quickly things shift, and it seems like a long time, but it's really not, especially when we're talking about, global changes.
That's right.
So I think of now more as an important data point in the argument for change moving forward, especially like when we saw the reduction in emissions in China when everything was shut down, factories were shut down, and you're seeing like clearing of air and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Where it's like when people can make the argument, okay, humans aren't actually having an impact, this is just normal, like the climate changes.
Right.
Then we could say, okay, well, let's look at this 2-3 month period of time where we weren't doing those things, and even in this time this is what happened.
Right.
It still won't convince everybody because there's always going to be holdouts, for better or for worse, but that's kind of what I see this situation as in this context, whether I'm right or wrong. But that's how I see it, as like another data point, another tool in the tool belt to argue for we do need to continue to make change, and here's definitive proof.
That's right. I think it adds a voice to the overall conversation.
Yeah.
And it gives us a lot of, I think, really interesting visuals and narratives of things that have happened, animals walking through streets in places they hadn't been seen before, and, on a very sort of local scale, as well as I think on a more global one. It would be interesting to see some sort of broader, and I haven't, and I'm sure maybe it's out there already, but some sort of broader analysis of greenhouse gas emissions globally as a result of the COVID crisis. But that'll be interesting to look back on as well. Yeah.
I feel like somebody's collecting that data, and I think I talked to Ian about this. I don't remember if I said at the beginning of our recorded conversation, but Ian Bolliger from episode 50 is who referred me to speak with Pavel, also about climate change. But I feel like I talked to Ian about the kind of similar situation. We were right at the beginning of stay-at-home orders. I think when I spoke with Ian, and I think we talked about like somebody's collecting that data. So
Oh,
it's
sure. Yeah.
it may not be immediately available, but I think we will see. I would hope at least a few different kind of institutions, present that data in different ways and show, hey, this impact happened here and that impact happened there. And Ian obviously is more on the economic side, trying to figure out what economic impact
Yep.
happens with climate change. So if you want to watch that episode, go back to episode 50. But um, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens long term. And I think for me, and probably for you, please correct me if I'm wrong, it even when things happen fast on, say a human timeline fast. So say we could get this done in a decade. A decade's relatively fast. So we could turn everything around and make things regenerative. A decade still seems like a long time from like a human perspective, even though it's really a very short turnaround.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, you think back to all of the, technology that we take for granted on a daily basis. iPhones came out in whatever it was, 2007.
Yeah.
And for me, they've been here forever. And somebody who's almost 50 now, that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah, I think there are some real challenges, and that's come up a few times in our conversation about sort of people's memory and people's, I guess, interpretation of the reality around them really is what it is, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to continue having these conversations and sort of to, maybe again, I'm sort of justifying my own passions, but important to continue doing this kind of thing, and writing about it, and sharing the experience and saying, look, yeah, we might have had this blip in 2020, when we look back at this, where this happened that was positive, this happened that was positive because of this great tragedy, which is, I think, a really interesting conversation in and of itself. But we're continuing to see the sort of exacerbated effects of greenhouse gas emissions, of global warming, of glacial melt, of this and of that, and they continue to have even greater knock-on effects on things like fishery populations, fish migrating north or south because of the changing of the salinity or the temperature of the ocean water. The systems are so complicated, that I think people who even are directly impacted by some of the things may not recognize that that's an impact of climate change. And so I think we need to continue having these conversations. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we're running short on time, there's a question I'm asking everybody this year.
Yep.
And I think will be particularly interesting to hear from you, given what you do. So I'm asking everybody this year, what do you think the purpose of sport is?
It's interesting. Well, I mean, for me, and I think the way that I have it sort of intentionally integrated, my sport with the teaching that I do, with the writing and et cetera. A quick plug for the college where I work, so Schumacher College, right? We run a series of master's programs, and we've recently just proposed one to start in 2021, on movement, mind, and ecology, which really gets at sort of the complete synergy of everything we've talked about today, where it will use movement, whatever that is, whether it's rock climbing or running or swimming or dance, as a way to connect with a broader ecological system, right? So for me, the role of sport, I mean, there's so many, roles it plays, right? My son, who's 15, is on the Nordic ski team, and sport plays a really essential, important role for him. But for me and for the work that I do, it's about creating an opening, creating a connection with the more than human world. And it doesn't matter what that sport is, whether you're walking for a mile down the road because it's your daily exercise during quarantine. You can connect with a natural landscape that way that you probably wouldn't have thought to do otherwise. Similarly, if you go cycle for a couple hundred miles or go run an ultra or something, you are connecting in a particular way with that particular landscape. So for me, that's essentially the purpose of sport, is to reconnect us with the more than human world as well as with ourselves.
It's the first time I've gotten that answer, so that's why I was excited to ask you that, because I was like, you're definitely going to have a unique perspective on what this is. Pavel, if people want to find you, keep up with Climate Run,
Yep.
Everything that's going on with you, where can they find you?
So just www.climaterun.org. I tend to keep that fairly updated, and there are descriptions of all the runs that I've done over the last few years, as well as some about plans that I have for the future. So, yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks for spending time with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Take care.